The era of good feelings basically ended due to the Panic of 1819. However, what really cemented that idea and drew sectionalism just that much further was Missouri's proposed introduction to the United States as a state. When the Missouri Territory applied for statehood, slaves had already been in that territory for a number of years. Therefore, Missouri applied to be a slave state. You see, at this point, there were 22 states in the nation, and as mentioned in a prior video, states were often being admitted in pairs, typically one up north and one in the south, such as we talked about Illinois, and then Alabama, and then Indiana and Mississippi, that sort of a thing. Okay, so in pairs. Well, Missouri applied for statehood in and of itself, and it applied as a slave state. You have abolitionists who believed that slavery should be curbed, and if we're going to admit a slave state, that's not going to go well. So you have a New York congressman, James Talmadge, who basically came up with an idea that, we are going to create a bill that would eliminate slavery in Missouri. So if we're going to admit Missouri, it's going to be done as slaves being freed, and those already there, they're not going to suffer the ravages of it. Okay? That's going to cause a lot of controversy in Missouri, which already has slaves there. And the slave holders would not stand for that. Further, that balance of slavery would need to be addressed elsewhere. Eventually, what we know today as Maine, the state of Maine, would apply for statehood too. And being up north, they would apply as a northern state. So, the opportunity to end some of the sectionalist ideas here really came into play. What if, Northerners, you admit Missouri as a slave state if you Southerners will admit Maine as a free state? Northerners threatened to block Missouri, and Southerners threatened to block Maine. So the idea of a compromise came into play here. Hey, give us what we want, we'll give you what you want, and we'll both be in balance. Okay. So what you see in 1820 is the admission of Missouri and Maine as states into the United States under the Missouri Compromise, to where, you're going to have an admission of states in pairs, Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state. However, in the Louisiana Territory, excluding Missouri, all other territories in the Louisiana Territory applying for statehood above the 3630 parallel, which is the modern border, southern border of Missouri, all states north of there in the Louisiana Territory, slavery would be outlawed. Okay. So, that would be known as the Missouri Compromise. You admit Missouri as slave, Maine as free. Anything north of the southern boundary of Missouri, excluding Missouri itself, in the Louisiana Purchase would be slave free. Okay? No slavery. What you saw here was a rising sectionalist ideology that would pit various different parts of the country against each other yet again. And back in American colonial days, you had the modern boundary of Maryland and Pennsylvania be drawn and surveyed by British surveyors that would basically draw a line south and north. You officially delineate what it means to have various different boundaries. That line is known as the Mason-Dixon line because it was surveyed by two guys named Mason and Dixon. that's the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland, the Mason-Dixon line. It's also an unofficial, kind of like the unofficial cultural boundary between free and slave states. Maryland and Virginia were slave states at that time. Everything north of there would eventually become the first free states in the United States. It would also draw a cultural difference that to this day still has significant ramifications. If you have ever heard of the American South referred to as Dixieland, that is because the South is south of the Mason-Dixon line. So therefore, Dixieland is essentially the American South. That's basically what that means. Okay? So you have Missouri and Maine admitted under the Missouri Compromise. However, also around this time, the Supreme Court draws a pretty thick line in delineating exactly what it means to have an expansion of federal power. The Supreme Court would basically decide that the federal government takes precedent over state governments in rights concerning sovereignty. One of the most notorious cases that would be brought to the Supreme Court would be Fletcher versus Peck. Basically, contract and the idea of contracts would become very prevalent in American legal society. The state of Georgia had, under the legislature, offered land grants that were deemed as being corrupt. And the legislature wanted to repeal those land grants. Well, those grants did have a contract, and as corrupt as they were, Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, serving as Chief Justice, and the Supreme Court recognized that, well, a contract is a contract. As corrupt as it is, we will recognize the sovereignty of that contract. Therefore, the Supreme Court is flexing its muscles. Okay? Another thing, Dartmouth College, that's in New Hampshire. The state legislature of New Hampshire wanted to turn private Dartmouth College into a state institution. Okay? When Dartmouth College resisted, their court case would eventually make its way to the Supreme Court. And under Dartmouth's charter, there was an actual contract which stated their right to be a private institution. The Supreme Court Justice, in recognition of that contract, basically said, yeah, we agree with the contract. Dartmouth, you are to stay a private institution. Sorry, state of New Hampshire. Okay. What you're starting to see here is a list of Supreme Court cases that sides with the federal government and federal interpretation of various different things. For example, eventually, the state of Georgia would try and invoke itself into the politics of tribal institutions, Native American tribes. And it was eventually deemed through various different decisions that Native American tribes, in and of themselves, have their own sovereignty. They would be treated more like a ward of the state of the federal government as opposed to under jurisdiction of a state. So, during this time in American history, you basically see the affirmation of the federal government as being the preeminent authority. And that somewhat delineates the idea of states and the federal government in a federalist system. Ultimately, the federal government would have the most authority. So you look today, modern day Oklahoma, quite a number of Native American reservations are there. They're considered their own sovereign territory, even though they're American, they're in the United States, and they're physically located in what is present-day Oklahoma. However, the state of Oklahoma does not have any sort of tribal authority in and amongst to jurisdict the tribes. There is no state jurisdiction in tribal lands in Oklahoma, even though they exist in the boundary of Oklahoma. The lands are somewhat autonomous. and regulated and governed by the tribes themselves, with the ultimate authority laying at the hands of the United States federal government. Okay? The state of Oklahoma has no jurisdiction in tribal lands in eastern Oklahoma. Okay? That would be something that would be reinforced. The federal primacy is being established here as the ultimate authority. Okay? Now, we mentioned Mexican independence in prior videos. Other things are really starting to shake up all over Latin America. Spain really has its handful. They've had a very good run in the Americas since the early 1500s. Their time's coming. A lot of these Latin American colonies that are under Spanish colonial oppression saw the United States declare and win its independence as their own sovereign nation against their European colonial oppressor. And that served as a motivating factor. That's an influence. That is something that we can use as a model for our own independence. And the United States encouraged this. They really set the tone for what would become all sorts of Latin American revolutionary movements. So the United States saw that, wow, okay. Spain had its whole Spanish Latin American continent in revolt in the early 1820s. And some of them had already won. The United States wanted to help these new fledgling countries diplomatically and establish trade with them. And even though John Quincy Adams really began the theory and doctrine, it was President James Monroe who would announce a policy basically to protect Latin American countries and in general the Western Hemisphere from European colonialism. In what is known as the Monroe Doctrine, the United States declared that no henceforth colonization of or future colonization of Americas by European colonial rule. Basically, hey, Europeans, your colonial days in the Western Hemisphere and in the Americas are over. And in doing so, the United States would exist to protect other American nations, especially in South America. So, current European powers could potentially still work in play, and especially as the British Navy was helping to thwart off French incursions all throughout the Americas. It became important as the Monroe Doctrine had an immediate effect of expressing the United States as being the biggest economic and dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. Okay? The United States set the precedent, set the tone. Latin American countries would soon follow. So, the Monroe Doctrine, no more European colonial expansion in the Americas.